Hello, good evening and a warm Yorkshire welcome from your host, me, B. I hope you're all doing okay. Everything's okay at this end, nothing much to report. The poll that I put on YouTube recently gave me a result of 58% in favour of cryptids, so that's what I've decided to do for tonight's Halloween special. I've also got a bonus at the end of a true account that I found on Reddit, and I read it, like you do, and asked permission to read it on my channel, and I got permission, so that's from Jack. So here's cryptids. The name Bigfoot is generally attributed to the mountainous western region of North America. The common name Sasquatch comes from the Salish Sasquatch, while the Algonquin of the north-central region of the continent refer to a Witico or Wendigo. Other nations tell of a large creature, much like a man, but imbued with special powers and characteristics. Each language had its name for the creature featured in the local version of such legends. Many names mean something like wild man or hairy man, although other names described common actions that it was said to perform, such as eating clams or shaking trees. Many of the indigenous cultures across the North American continent include tales of mysterious hair-covered creatures living in forests, and according to anthropologist David Daegling, these legends existed long before contemporary reports of the creature described as Bigfoot. These stories differed in their details regionally and between families in the same community, and are particularly prevalent in the Pacific Northwest. North American settlers started reporting sightings during the late 1800s and into the 1900s, with the occasional finding of footprints, sporadic encounters, and even a few grainy photos and videos adding to the mystery. Those who claim to have seen Bigfoot have described everything from a large upright ape to an actual hairy human, sometimes standing over 8 feet tall and described as powerfully built. The debate and research continue. Entire organisations exist to study and document Bigfoot and prove its existence, and groups regularly search the Northwest woods looking for that ultimate proof. Here in the UK we have our own group, Being Believed Research and Investigations, led by Deborah Hatswell, of which I'm a member. What initially started as a UK Bigfoot research group has grown exponentially, and now includes sightings and accounts of other cryptids in the UK, such as Dogman. Deborah doesn't just receive reports on encounters with cryptids. There are a whole host of otherworldly accounts coming in, from trolls to apparitions. It's all out there. Unlike a lot of other organisations, Deborah thoroughly interviews and vets witnesses to ensure that their account is genuine. Sadly, some people will fabricate an account, seemingly for their try at 15 minutes of fame. And this type of dishonesty has an effect on genuine witnesses coming forward. There are a myriad of witnesses to strange creatures and events in the UK. Eyewitnesses who can't get to grips with what they've seen, myself included. Ensuring genuine witnesses are heard and believed is crucial to mapping and understanding what we have going on in the UK and establishing patterns and sighting areas. So if you haven't already, please head over to the BBR Facebook page and Deborah's YouTube channel, the links for which I'll post in the description on this video. Thank you. One of the most famous Bigfoot sightings allegedly occurred on Meeker Mountain in British Columbia in 1955, when a man called William Roes claimed he saw a partly human and partly animal creature while hiking. He swore an affidavit in 1957 that the creature was about 6 feet tall and covered in brown silver-tipped hair, with thick arms reaching down to its knees, broad feet and breasts. Here is William's affidavit. Please bear in mind that the year was 1957 and attitudes and language has changed, but I felt to keep the authenticity of the actual affidavit, I didn't want to change anything. So please excuse the language. Ever since I was a small boy back in the forest of Michigan, I have studied the lives and habits of wild animals. Later, when I supported my family in northern Alberta by hunting and trapping, I spent many hours just observing the wild things. They fascinated me. But the most incredible experience I ever had with a wild creature occurred near a little town called Tete, Jaune, British Columbia, about 80 miles west of Jasper, Alberta. I'd been working on the highway near Tete, Jaune for about 2 years. In October 1955, I decided to climb 5 miles up Meeker Mountain to an old deserted mine, just for something to do. I came in sight of the mine about 3 o'clock in the afternoon after an easy climb. I had just come out of a patch of low brush into a clearing when I saw what I thought was a grizzly bear in the bush on the other side. I had shot a grizzly near that spot the year before. This one was only about 75 yards away, but I didn't want to shoot it, for I had no way of getting it out. So I sat down on a small rock and watched, my rifle in my hands. I could see part of the animal's head and the top of one shoulder. A moment later it raised up and stepped out into the opening. Then I saw it was not a bear. This, to the best of my recollection, is what the creature looked like and how it acted as it came across the clearing directly towards me. My first impression was of a huge man, about 6 feet tall, almost 3 feet wide, and probably weighing somewhere near 300 pounds. It was covered from head to foot with dark brown, silver-tipped hair, but as it came closer, I saw by its breast that it was female. And yet its torso was not curved like a female's. Its broad frame was straight from shoulder to hip. Its arms were much thicker than a man's, and longer, almost reaching to its knees. Its feet were broader proportionally than a man's, about 5 inches wide at the front, and tapering to much thinner heels. When it walked, it placed the heel of its foot down first, and I could see the grey-brown skin or hide on the soles of its feet. It came to the edge of the bush I was hiding in, within 20 feet of me, and squatted down on its haunches. Reaching out its hands, it pulled the branches of the bushes towards it and stripped the leaves with its teeth. Its lips curled flexibly around the leaves as it ate. I was close enough to see that its teeth were white and even. The shape of this creature's head somewhat resembled a Negro's. The head was higher at the back than at the front. The nose was broad and flat. The lips and chin protruded further than its nose, but the hair that covered it, leaving bare only the parts of its face around the mouth, nose and ears, made it resemble an animal as much as a human. None of this hair, even on the back of its head, was longer than an inch, and that on its face was much shorter. Its ears were shaped like a human's ears, but its eyes were small and black like a bear's, and its neck was also unhuman, thicker and shorter than any man's I had ever seen. As I watched this creature, I wondered if some movie company was making a film at this place, and that what I saw was an actor, made up to look partly human and partly animal. But as I observed it more, I decided it would be impossible to fake such a specimen. Anyway, I learned later that there was no such company near that area, nor in fact did anyone live up Meeker Mountain, according to the people who live in Tete Jaune. Finally, the wild thing must have got my scent, for it looked directly at me through an opening in the brush. A look of amazement crossed its face. It looked so comical at that moment I had to grin. Still in a crouched position, it backed up 3 or 4 short steps, then straightened up to its full height and started to walk rapidly back the way it had come. For a moment it watched me over its shoulder as it went, not exactly afraid, but as though it wanted no contact with anything strange. The thought came to me that if I shot it, I would possibly have a specimen of great interest to scientists the world over. I had heard stories of the Sasquatch, the giant hairy Indians that live in the legends of British Columbia Indians, and also many claim are still in fact alive today. Maybe this was a Sasquatch, I told myself. I levelled my rifle. The creature was still walking rapidly away, again turning its head to look in my direction. I lowered the rifle. Although I have called the creature it, I felt now that it was a human being, and I knew I would never forgive myself if I killed it. Just as it came to the other patch of brush, it threw its head back and made a peculiar noise that seemed to be half laugh and half language, and which I can only describe as a kind of whinny. Then it walked from the small brush into a stand of lodgepole pine. I stepped out into the opening and looked across the small ridge just beyond the pine to see if I could see it again. It came out on the ridge a couple of 100 yards away from me, tipped its head back again, and again emitted the only sound I had heard it make. But what this half laugh, half language was meant to convey, I do not know. It disappeared then, and I never saw it again. I wanted to find out if it lived on vegetation entirely or ate meat as well, so I went down and looked for signs. I found it in 5 different places, and although I examined it thoroughly, could find no hair or shells of bugs or insects, so I believe it was strictly a vegetarian. I found one place where it had slept for a couple of nights under a tree. Now the nights were cool up the mountain, at this time of year especially, and yet it had not used a fire. I found no sign that it possessed even the simplest of tools, nor a single companion while in this place. Whether this was a Sasquatch I do not know. It will always remain a mystery to me, unless another is found. I hereby declare the above statement to be in every part true, to the best of my powers of observation and recollection. Signed, William Roe. This account comes from the Bow Valley Provincial Park in Alberta, where in June 1996, Chief Editor of Animal Watch, Alex Michael, wrote of her encounter with a Sasquatch in Volume 1, Issue 10. My family has always been notorious for doing things at odd hours, and as you may well know, the strangest things always happen late at night. It was an unusually warm autumn, some years ago, and at 16 years of age I had just finished a summer job as an arts and crafts camp counsellor. The only thing left to do was to pick up a rather large trunk filled with my belongings. Unable to fit such a large trunk inside the VW Beetle I had purchased just a few weeks before, my mother was volunteered to transport it from the mountains back to the city in the larger of the family cars. Summer camp was a very wild place for me, with staff partying every night until the wee hours of the morning. My room was near the entrance of the staff residence, where all these parties took place. By late July, sleep-deprived party wimps like myself were weeded out, so I built a single mattress-sized platform in the woods and then covered it with polyplastic. It was a 15-minute walk through dense forest to get there from the residence or the road. Bow Valley Provincial Park, an undisturbed protected forest, was only a stone's throw away. It is there that my mother, a small dog named Willow, and myself were going to retrieve my trunk at 3 o'clock on a Monday morning. Why 3 in the morning? I could say it was the heat, but it was mostly because my father had not yet been told that the car would be leaving town. There was also the adolescent fear that knowledge of the platform construction would somehow reflect itself in a summer paycheck I had not yet received. My mother had to be at work by 6:30, so we had less than an hour to complete this covert action. As we approached the highway turn-off, a sliver of the moon cast a glowing border around southwestern Alberta's Mount Yamnuska. Driving several miles along the gravel road, the camp looked deserted. Summer staff had cleared out several weeks before, and a handful of permanent staff were either taking days off in the city or asleep in cabins several miles from the summer campsite. Angling off the side of the road, my mother left the headlights on, pointing into the trees. There was some discussion about taking the 20-pound dog named Willow for protection. However, Willow's track record for wandering off severely threatened a successful completion of the mission. Plus, very uncharacteristically, the dog named Willow refused to get out of the car and was now partially hidden under the driver's seat. Car headlights were of no value after the first few seconds of meandering through the forest. We had a flashlight, but I was having difficulty remembering the exact location. The 15-minute walk turned into a 30-minute skin-scraping bushwhack, but finally we arrived at the isolated platform, even though the flashlight batteries were now dead. I assured my mother that all that needed to be done was to take down the polyplastic rain cover and carry back a mattress in the trunk. It should only take 2 trips. She was noticeably silent as we began working in the darkness. My mother began untying strings securing the poly to the ground, and I was kneeling on top of the 4-foot-high platform. Stretching up to reach some tangled binder twine knots tied to a tree, a pungent smell suddenly flooded the air. My eyes moved from the knots to the tall length of plastic. There, distorted through the semi-transparent poly, was a huge shadow only about 7 feet away. With the 4-foot platform and me kneeling on top, the creature was easily at eye level. A split second later, there was an incredibly loud screaming roar. Although I know of nothing to describe it, the sound was like a peacock scream, a bear growl, and a lion roar all somehow combined. I can't tell you if I screamed. I can't tell you much of anything, other than my eyes continued to peer through the plastic at this massive shadow. My 5'3" mother had somehow leaped into the air and was now up on the platform beside me. Whatever it was finally turned and walked slowly away on its long hind feet. We continued watching as each heavy step could be heard contracting the ground. There were no visible ears, just a sparse, mohawk-like fringe sprouting up from the tapering top of the creature's head. From behind, the upper body appeared massive. It continued to walk upright until disappearing into the trees. We stayed on top of the platform, motionless, for some time after. Then I finally started ripping down the plastic. I have no idea what my mother did during the next 40 or 50 seconds, but my next memory was power walking through the forest, balancing a single mattress on top of my head with one hand and carrying the handle of the trunk in the other. I assumed my mother was holding up the other end of the trunk. With Willow still hidden under the driver's seat, it was a very quiet drive home. Late at night, they say that your mind can play tricks on you, but I am so certain. Brown bears have been in the area that summer, but I have never seen a bear walk upright that smoothly, or for that long a time. Or could it have been a very large, long-furred man standing over 7 feet in height? I say man because intuition tells me that the creature was a male. Could it have been a Sasquatch that night? I will never really know for sure, but you can bet that I will keep telling the story as if it were. Another sighting in 2005 is an anonymous one from Red Deer, Alberta. My wife and I and our oldest son are occasional birders up and around Red Deer, Alberta. My son and I worked 20 years together in the petrochemical business. We are known here in this province, thus it is my preference to be anonymous. We have a place in the Waskasoo area near the Red Deer River. My other sons work in construction over in Sylvan Lake area. The summer of 2005, the wife packed us up a lunch and the field glasses and sent us off to a place near Kicking Horse Pass, not far from Lake Louise. At highways 1 and 93, there is a fork there to go either direction, and we usually picnic there. But this day had a distraction. I became sidetracked when we stopped in Canmore, alongside the Bow River there. I had pulled off to a side area there, just a holler from the bridge, and was scanning the bush across the water, looking mainly for ruby-crowned kinglets, orange-crowned warblers, or those dark-eyed juncos. It was then my field glasses fell upon a dark figure there. A weird feeling overcame me, like I was intruding on someone's private rendezvous, but I held the glasses on it, trying to make a better ident, and at the same time yelled at my son to grab his camera. He didn't hear me. I yelled again, and as I did, this time the dark figure moved in my field of vision, a bit to its right. I think it must have turned around and looked in my direction. Half of the dark figure was against the trees, and the rest of the figure was outlined by willows of a lighter colour than the figure. At the same time I took note of a dead tree, which was approximately a bit shorter than the figure in my glasses. It seems to me in those fleeting seconds that the dark figure was looking at us, or at least in our direction, and I was looking at it. It was, or appeared to be, a very large dark-coloured man-shaped figure, but all black, no line markings for clothing. No clear delineation of figures, just a tall dark figure standing there in the trees, with arms I presume to be at its side. I forgot all about the ruby crowns, and yelled again to my son, who is by now making his way over to my canvas stool. I pointed and handed him my field glasses, but he saw nothing, and I could not relocate the dark figure again. My son suggested that we had disturbed another birder. We walked in the direction of the figure, calling out to him but got no answer. We got to the tree I had taken notice of in the field glasses, and that dead tree that was shorter in my vision compared to the dark figure was exactly 9 feet up. It was then I told my son the situation, and we stood looking at one another, completely puzzled at what would be over 9 feet tall. He thought I'd been wrong in what I saw, I was not. I know that tree was shorter than the dark figure. I'm not sure what this was, but it may have been a Sasquatch. For sure it wasn't a bear. This was different. It wasn't people. It made no sounds I could hear over the river noise, and I have no better description than it was a large dark figure on the other side looking back at us, just standing there. Then it was gone. There were no other cars parked or on the road when this happened, and we noticed nothing else of any significance, like smell or tracks. There was nothing. Birders that we are, we went on about our day, but that image stays in my head. Most unusual thing I ever saw that I couldn't explain, and I only saw it for a short time. And I have convinced myself enough to post this to several websites, although it may be insignificant to you. Lee County, South Carolina. The legend and folklore of the cryptid known as the Lizard Man has existed since that first fateful sighting in the summer of 1988. The Lizard Man is Lee County's very own homegrown monster, a 7-foot-tall, red-eyed, scaly-skinned reptile that emerged from Sasquatch Swamp one dark and humid night in July 1988 to scare the living daylights out of a young Lee County kid. Chris Davis, a Bishopville teen on his way home after his shift ended at McDonald's, blew a tyre out on his car in the Browntown area of the county, very close to the edge of Sasquatch Swamp. The young man got out of his car and was working to change the flat when he suddenly heard a sound, almost like someone or something running on the asphalt. It was coming closer and closer through the dark night towards him. When the shadowy shape slowly started to take form, Davis couldn't believe what he was seeing. He would later describe the creature as standing about 7 feet tall, with green scaly skin, red eyes and 3 toes on each foot. The Lizard Man had made his first public appearance. Davis jumped back into the safety of his car and rode away, but not before the creature attacked his car, ripping off a side mirror and jumping atop the 17-year-old's car and viciously denting the roof. The attack was later reported to then Sheriff Liston Truesdale, who, along with his deputies, took the incident seriously and investigated the claims, especially after Davis took, and passed, a polygraph test. A few weeks later, several folks who lived in the vicinity of Sasquatch Swamp reported having their cars attacked by some kind of creature that ripped off and possibly chewed bumpers. Deputies stayed quite busy that summer, chasing down lizard leads, even discovering enormous 3-toed footprints left in the swamp by some type of creature and making plaster casts of them. Smith's Concrete cast a 3-foot-tall statue of the Lizard Man, which sold like hotcakes and can now be seen in strategic locations around town. A big shout out goes to Robbie Howell, artist and administrator of the Lizard Man Lounge on Facebook, for his efforts from 1988 until now in preserving the legend. It takes everyone working together to keep the legend alive, and that is our goal. Lee County owns the legend of the Lizard Man, and we intend to keep it. The scientific community explains alleged sightings of the Loch Ness monster as hoaxes, wishful thinking, and the misidentification of mundane objects. The pseudoscience and subculture of cryptozoology has placed particular emphasis on the creature. The earliest report of a monster in the vicinity of Loch Ness appears in the Life of St Columba by Adamnan, written in the 7th century AD. According to Adamnan, writing about a century after the events described, Irish monk St Columba was staying in the land of the Picts with his companions when he encountered local residents burying a man by the River Ness. They explained that the man was swimming in the river when he was attacked by a water beast that mauled him and dragged him underwater, despite their attempts to rescue him by boat. Columba sent a follower, Luigni Moku Min, to swim across the river. The beast approached him, but Columba made the sign of the cross and said, "Go no further, do not touch the man, go back at once." The creature stopped as if it had been pulled back with ropes and fled, and Columba's men and the Picts gave thanks for what they perceived as a miracle. Believers in the monster point to this story, set in the River Ness rather than the loch itself, as evidence for the creature's existence as early as the 6th century. Skeptics question the narrative's reliability, noting that water beast stories were extremely common in medieval hagiographies, and Adamnan's tale probably recycles a common motif attached to a local landmark. According to skeptics, Adamnan's story may be independent of the modern Loch Ness monster legend and became attached to it by proximity and by believers seeking to bolster their claims. In October 1871 or 1872, depending on records, D. Mackenzie of Balnain reportedly saw an object resembling a log or an upturned boat wriggling and churning up the water, moving slowly at first before disappearing at a faster speed. The account was not published until 1934, when Mackenzie sent his story in a letter to Rupert Gould, who was then Lieutenant Commander of the Royal British Navy, shortly after popular interest in the monster increased. In 1888, Mason Alexander MacDonald of Abriachan sighted a large stubby-legged animal surfacing from the loch and propelling itself within 50 yards of the shore where MacDonald stood. MacDonald reported his sighting to Loch Ness water bailiff Alex Campbell and described the creature as looking like a salamander. The best-known article that first attracted a great deal of attention about a creature was published on the 2nd of May 1933 in the Inverness Courier about a large beast or whale-like fish. The article by Alex Campbell, water bailiff for Loch Ness and a part-time journalist, discussed a sighting by Aldy Mackay of an enormous creature with the body of a whale rolling in the water in the loch, while she and her husband John were driving on the A82 on the 15th of April 1933. The word monster was reportedly applied for the first time in Campbell's article, although some reports claim that it was coined by editor Evan Barron. The Courier in 2017 published excerpts from the Campbell article, which had been titled "Strange Spectacle in Loch Ness." The creature disported itself, rolling and plunging for fully a minute, its body resembling that of a whale and the water cascading and churning like a simmering cauldron. Soon, however, it disappeared in a boiling mass of foam. Both onlookers confessed that there was something uncanny about the whole thing, for they realised that here was no ordinary denizen of the depths, because apart from its enormous size, the beast, in taking the final plunge, sent out waves that were big enough to have been caused by a passing steamer. Modern interest in the monster was sparked by a sighting on the 22nd of July in 1933, when George Spicer and his wife saw a most extraordinary form of animal cross the road in front of their car. They described the creature as having a large body, about 4 feet high and 25 feet long, and a long wavy narrow neck, slightly thicker than an elephant's trunk, and as long as the 10 to 12 foot width of the road. They saw no limbs. It lurched across the road towards the loch 20 yards away, leaving a trail of broken undergrowth in its wake. Spicer described it as the nearest approach to a dragon or prehistoric animal that I have ever seen in my life, and as having a long neck which moved up and down in the manner of a scenic railway. It had an animal in its mouth, and had a body that was fairly big with a high back, but if there were any feet they must have been of the webbed kind, and as for a tail I cannot say, it moved so rapidly. and when we got to the spot it had probably disappeared into the loch. Though he was the first to describe the creature as a plesiosaur-like dinosaur, evidence suggested by researchers at Columbia University in 2013 proved his story to be fake. The university and Daniel Loxton suggested that Spicer's sighting was fictionalised and inspired by a long-necked dinosaur that rises out of a lake in King Kong, a film that was extremely popular in theatres in his home city of London during August 1933, when Spicer reported the sighting. Loxton and Donald Prothero later cited King Kong as evidently an influence on the Loch Ness Monster myth. On January 5, 1934, a motorcyclist, Arthur Grant, claimed to have nearly hit the creature while approaching Abriachan, near the northeastern end of the loch, at about 1 a.m. on a moonlit night. According to Grant, it had a small head attached to a long neck. The creature saw him and crossed the road back to the loch. Grant, a veterinary student, described it as a cross between a seal and a plesiosaur. He said he dismounted and followed it to the loch, but saw only ripples. The surgeon's photograph is reportedly the first photo of the creature's head and neck. Supposedly taken by Robert Kenneth Wilson, a London gynaecologist, it was published in the Daily Mail on the 21st of April 1934. Wilson's refusal to have his name associated with it led to it being known as the surgeon's photograph. According to Wilson, he was looking at the loch when he saw the monster, grabbed his camera and snapped 4 photos. Only 2 exposures came out clearly. The first reportedly shows a small head and back, and the second shows a similar head in a diving position. The first photo became well known, and the second attracted little publicity because of its blurriness. For 60 years, the photo was considered evidence of the monster's existence, although skeptics dismissed it as driftwood, an elephant, an otter, or a bird. The photo's scale was controversial. It is often shown cropped, making the creature seem large and the ripples like waves, while the uncropped shot shows the other end of the loch and the monster in the centre. The ripples in the photo were found to fit the size and pattern of small ripples rather than large waves photographed up close. Analysis of the original image fostered further doubt. In 1993, the makers of the Discovery Communications documentary, Loch Ness Discovered, analysed the uncropped image and found a white object visible in every version of the photo, implying that it was on the negative. It was believed to be the cause of the ripples, as if the object was being towed, although the possibility of a blemish on the negative could not be ruled out. An analysis of the full photograph indicated that the object was small, about 60 to 90 centimetres long. Since 1994, most agree that the photo was an elaborate hoax. It had been described as fake in a 7th of December 1975 Sunday Telegraph article that fell into obscurity. Details of how the photo was taken were published in the 1999 book Nessie, The Surgeon's Photograph Exposed, which contains a facsimile of the 1975 Sunday Telegraph article. The creature was reportedly a toy submarine built by Christian Sperling, the son-in-law of actor, screenwriter, director, producer and perhaps most saliently, big game hunter M.A. Wetherill. Sperling admitted the photograph was a hoax in January 1991. Wetherill had been publicly ridiculed by his employer, the Daily Mail, after he found Nessie footprints that turned out to be a hoax. To get revenge on the Mail, Wetherill perpetrated his hoax with co-conspirators Sperling, who was a sculpture specialist, Ian Colin Marmaduke Wetherill, his son, himself a future actor, who bought the material for the fake, and Maurice Chambers, an insurance agent. While it may not be proof of the Loch Ness Monster's existence, the surgeon's photograph had a tremendous impact on the thoughts, ideas and beliefs of many people around the world. It remains an important part of photo history and serves as a reminder of photography's fickle relationship with the truth. I saw an interesting true account on Reddit a few weeks back, and I thought you'd like to hear it, so I got in touch with Jack, who wrote it, and he said it's okay for me to narrate it on my channel, so here goes. This is Jack's Dogman encounter. A few people have asked me to tell my story on here a few times, so here goes. It's going to be a bit of a long one. This was about 23 years ago, and I had no clue what a dogman was, and I didn't believe in anything supernatural back then. I was hunting wild hogs in one of the southernmost areas of the Great Dismal Swamp. This is far south of the wildlife refuge, where it ends at the Albemarle Sound in eastern North Carolina. I'd put my boat in the water at a friend's house about half an hour by water from where I went into the swamp at. This was in late November, so it was pretty cold and really overcast, and it gets dark around 5 or so. It was about noon when I had tied up and got out of the boat. First hour or so was pretty uneventful. I was working my way inland. Some of this part of the swamp can be walked through when the tide is low, and it's just marshy with deeper canals and bogs scattered about. But there aren't any trails or marked paths or anything, so you really have to pay attention to where you're going, and definitely need a compass, since you can't see the sun. It's pretty dark in there, even on bright and sunny days. I was back in there about 2 hours, and looking for sign of hogs. I could tell some had been back there at some point, but it had been a while. I got a little further in and started smelling what I had thought was a boar. It's rutting season and male wild hogs have a very distinct smell. It's musky and kind of fermented smell, mixed with old poop and urine. Kind of hard to explain if you've never smelt it before. However, this was different. It was musky, but more like an outside dog that's soaking wet. I stopped to look and listen, and after 10 or so minutes I started hearing a snuffling, breathing that came and went. After a bit I started to hear some growling. I started to get a little freaked out because it didn't sound like a hog and it sounded big. I stopped again and knelt down and waited and looked around. Where I was at the brush was pretty thick, so I really couldn't see more than 20 or so feet in any direction. That's when I started seeing movement. It definitely wasn't moving like a hog. It was kinda low, walking crouched down, but not on all fours, and I was only getting glimpses of it, and it would stop. It was probably about 40 foot away. This is when I actually start getting scared. I was born in northeastern Kentucky, and spent most of my free time as a kid in the woods, camping, riding dirt bikes, and have always been comfortable even in the deep woods. So when I moved to North Carolina, I fell in love with the swamp. This is the first time I think I'd ever felt real and actual fear. I had a Mossberg 590 shotgun, full of 3-inch buckshot, but no extra shells and no pistol. The 590 also has a bayonet lug, so I took out the bayonet and put it on. I started backing up, not taking my eyes off where I'd last seen whatever it was. A few minutes later I hear it again a little further over to my left. I'm probably about 3/4 of a mile into the swamp wick. Doesn't seem very far, but the terrain doesn't make for really quick movement. This goes on for about another 20 minutes while backtracking out as fast as I can, and I'm still hearing it and catching glimpses of movement, and the smell is getting stronger. After a bit I realise that this thing has gotten between me and the way I came in from my boat, and I'm starting to panic. I tried to start getting further away from it, and I headed in the right direction, and then I see it again and it's standing up, and it's pretty damn tall. It was still back in the brush, so I couldn't really make out any details, as it's dark as hell back there. I wanted to cry and run, but I knew that was a bad idea. It didn't seem like it wanted to get in the water, so I started wading through the canal, headed back towards my boat. I started to put some distance between it and myself, so I got back on hard ground to move a little faster, but I can still hear it snuffling and growling and moving through the brush, but it's not close anymore. I made it back to my boat and I'm soaking wet and freezing, but I thank God I made it out of there, and just in time, as it's getting foggy and starting to drizzle. I have never been that scared in my life. I made it back to my buddy's house, Nad, to tell him what happened, and I can tell he knows something when I tell him where I went. He brings me in and gives me some hot coffee with a big slug of bourbon in it. When I calm down, he takes me to the other house out back of his property, where his granddad lives. I'd met his granddad before, but he'd always been kind of standoffish to me. I found out later he'd just had real bad PTSD from Korea. And he, my buddy and his family, had lived in that area since after the Civil War. I think his granddad's great-granddad had been a slave around there, but that's a story for another day. I guess what I mean to say is his family had a history in that area and knew the place a lot better than me. After I told his granddad what had happened, he stood up, looked me in the eye and said, "Don't go back in there. You're lucky you made it out. That's where the big dogs live." I left and went home and slept for about 18 hours. I tried to forget about that experience and started to believe I was just seeing shit and freaked myself out. I eventually forgot all about it until a few years ago when a Dogman Encounters video came up in my YouTube feed. I was curious what the hell a Dogman was, so I started listening to it, and that whole experience came flooding back to mind. It was very similar to what happened to me. I started looking into it, and there have been other sightings and encounters in eastern North Carolina. So that's my story. I'm 44 now and still live in coastal North Carolina, but I haven't been back anywhere close to that area. I still hunt and love the outdoors and the swamp, but don't go too far in anymore. And that, my dear viewers, is your Halloween special for 2024. I really appreciate you all being here. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed making it, as usual. And all being well, I will be back for a Christmas special. I've got a couple of health issues going on at the moment that are a little bit up in the air. So I don't actually know what's going on, but all being well, if I can get a Christmas special out, I will do. So until then, stay safe, look after each other, look after yourselves, and don't forget, stay spooky.